Good morning, Long Island, and welcome to CMM Live. My name is Joe Campolo. I'm the managing partner, Campolo, Milton McCormick, your host here at CMM Live. It is Tuesday, October 30th. It's a beautiful fall day out there, and we have a great program ahead of us today. But before we get into our program, I do want to make some opening remarks about the tragedy we saw happen in our country in Pittsburgh this Saturday. And I'll tell you, Saturday reminded us that evil is among us. It showed its face in the form of AntiSemitism and a gunman that gunned down 11 people, murdered them, defenseless people whose only crime was being in a house of worship and worshiping God. And before we start our show, I would like to read their names as a tribute to them and a show of solidarity across America and across the world to let everyone know that these acts will not be tolerated. We will not stand by for them, and we will always remember those that have fallen. Bernice Simon, age 84. Sylvan Simon, age 86. Melvin Wax, age 88. Daniel Stein, age 71. Irvin Younger, age 69. Rose Malinger, age 97. Jerry Rabinowitz, age 66. Joyce Feinberg, age 75. Richard Gottfried, age 65. Cecil Rosenthal, age 59. And David Rosenthal, age 54. May you all rest in peace. You know, although it may seem coincidental, today's show is actually very appropriate and very poignant in light of the headlines and this particular horrible headline. What we like to do here on CMM Live is highlight business and community leaders who are finding solutions and working together to solve our problems, understanding that government can't solve all of our problems. We need the community. We need other resources to do it. And today we are joined by Rabbi Gadi Capela, the congregation of Tifereth Israel in Greenport, and Father Roy Tvrdik, the Shrine of Our Lady of the Island in Manorville. And what these two fine gentlemen have done, and we're going to talk about today, is they are co-founders, along with a third party, of Project Genesis. And what Project Genesis does is it takes folks of the Christian faith and folks of the Jewish faith and discusses and teaches and educates and shows and celebrates our commonality rather than our differences. And how important is that message today in the world and on Long Island and in the business community, that we are more alike than we are different. Under God, we are all human. And that's our message that's going to be today. So, Rabbi, Father, welcome.
Thank you, John.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
It has been a very emotional weekend. I'm sure it's caused us all to sort of scratch our heads, but it makes it seem like the work you're doing has so much critical importance right now. So talk to us about Project Genesis. Talk to us about what it is. Talk to us about how it came to pass, how it started, how you thought about it. Talk to us about that. It's very important.
Well, I guess I could begin with meeting, at the time, Rabbi Gadi was not a rabbi, and we began conversations with beginning to discuss. He found out I was a priest. You know, we had discussions about, right away, we went right into theology, and he said he had never met a priest before. So I said, well, I've met lots of Jews. I grew up in Long Island, so it's not something new for me. And so we began to have discussions, and it was amazing how he kind of blew up my brain and I blew up his brain with simple discussions back and forth. And he was already teaching a small group in his apartment in the city. And then I invited him to come to a model Seder that I was planning at the SUNY Old Westbury as a chaplain over there. And so I asked him if he could host it and really guide us through. So why don't you take it from there? What happened for you?
So when I met Father Roy, I was still in business, and I was always interested in Jewish studies. I never in my wildest dreams thought to be a rabbi. And when Father Roy invited me to lead the Model Seder, I really honestly thought that if I did anything ritualistic with a Christian, it wouldn't be appropriate. So I consulted one of my rabbis, and he actually surprisingly said it would be okay. And that Model Seder really put us on the track for this past 13 years. So 2 miracles happened in this event. One, we didn't know how many people to plan, and we decided to plan for 25 people, and exactly 25 people showed. That was for me the first sign. And then the second one was going around the table, as we do normally in a Jewish Seder. Each person reads a section. And when we got to a section of the 4th child, there's the 4 children, and the 4th child is the child that does not know how to ask. He's so removed from context that he doesn't know how to even engage in a conversation. And that person actually couldn't ask. He was, at that point...
He had gone through surgery for cancer and had a laryngectomy. And so it was really amazing as I saw where it was going, and then suddenly it fell to him, and he was immediately opposite the long table from where Gadi was, and he just put his hands up and he went, I was like, oh, wow, what an amazing moment there when he could not ask. And so I feel that was kind of a beginning of how we saw Project Genesis happening, that Christians don't know how to ask a lot to find out about our Jewish roots. I grew up in Long Island, as I said, and I've always been kind of interested in Judaism, and while I was in the seminary, I belonged to an organization called the National Conference of Christians and Jews, and we had a program called Seminarians Interacting. And what we did there is we visited each other's seminaries and went to the programs and spent days and days visiting and in these dialogues. And it was always interesting to me that in those, we had 6 little groups. They were all broken up: Catholic, Jewish, Protestant, mainline Protestants, Black Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and that's 5 of them. Anyway, and every year that I was in that 4-year program, it was interesting how the Jews and the Catholics got along pretty well, and would always stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning, having discussions and all the rest. So I've always been interested in the Jewish roots of Christianity, to understand what that is and why. What's, of course, obviously there's differences, with Jesus, but as the church separated from the synagogue. But that part of history is always so fascinating to me. So now, since so many times we've now done pilgrimages together, we're able to introduce other people into this wonderful communion, actually. And I really do see it as a terrible divorce that happened in the family between father and son, basically, if you want to use this analogy. And now the son has reached out after 2,000 years of being away, trying to reach out to the father to say, wow, teach me again. Let me hear where I came from. So I see many, many Christians now, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, all kind of like, what? Tell us. There's a beautiful scripture, I had to find it for Gadi. It says, the day will come when the Gentile will grab the Jew by the coat and say, take me to Jerusalem. So I see that happening, in our day.
Yeah, and that's sort of what really interested me. I met Father Roy at a 50th birthday party, and we started talking about this. And he spoke so very highly of you and of Project Genesis, and I knew I had to meet you, so we've gotten to know each other pretty well. And I'm so interested because there is so much more in common than is not. Yet the whole focus tends to be on what's not common. And I think we can all learn from each other. And you talk about Jerusalem, and I know you guys do an annual pilgrimage to Israel with those of faith. So talk about that. Talk about that whole process, because I think it's really important.
So I'll start with right after the first Seder, we went on our first pilgrimage together with a very small group. And it was interesting to me, it was an eye-opener because I grew up in Israel, but I never saw certain things and certain places that I saw with the Christian group. So I told them when we went to the Sea of Galilee, I didn't realize this is such a holy place. This is where I used to go to the beach, as a kid. So I realized that Jews, and I was educated. I already had a master's in Jewish studies, and I was clueless about Christianity. So just as much as Christianity needs to learn about Judaism and its roots, we need to learn about Christianity to educate ourselves in the bigger picture. So when we came back from the first pilgrimage, people asked us to start teaching. And then that's how Project Genesis and the name Project Genesis originated, because we wanted to know where to start. And we figured, okay, let's start in the beginning. And since we share the text of Genesis, we thought it would be a good idea. And we started teaching that, and I would take the train once a month from the city. And we started from Genesis 1:1, and it took us 7 years to finish the book. And 2 years into it, I quit my job and went into rabbinical school for 4 years, and then finished rabbinical school, got the job with the congregation in Greenport, and only then, after 7 years, we finished. But throughout that, we also took trips to the Holy Land. And for me now, when I go to Israel every year, I don't see it only as Israel. I do see it in the fullness as a holy land, as a land that really encompasses all three faiths and have room for all three faiths. So through the pilgrimages and through Father Roy's eyes, I was able to see an aspect that I've never seen before.
It's such an important message, I think, right? So if you have just blinders on and you're only seeing life from one perspective, I almost feel like the fullness is missing, because you're not testing it from other pieces of information. You're not verifying beliefs that you may have in tests. And I've always felt that faith is something that should be questioned and tested and verified to be able to strengthen it for your own faith. And I'd like to hear from either of you. For your own faith, how has this collaboration together really helped, open those blinders up, but yet fortified your own faith in God?
Well, I would say, the first moment there where Gadi said, I'm going home for Passover, do you want to come? And then we formed this little group. We had 5 of us that went. And the most striking thing that he said was, he says, I want to see Jerusalem through the eyes of a Christian. I have no access to that. And I want to show you Jerusalem through the eyes of a Jew. Wow, that's interesting. Okay, let's go. And and everywhere we went, there was more and more insights into the land itself. A good guide, when he takes you to the Holy Land, or she takes you to the Holy Land, will start out with the first moment by saying, for Christians, you are now entering the 5th gospel. The 5th gospel. Now, we know we had 4. What do you mean 5? The 5th gospel. The land itself is another gospel. It is where God has worked with humanity for 4,000 years. And the land itself even begins to teach you, from the north to the south, and the east and the west, the highlands to the lowlands. And learning all of these places where they are, it just blows up the biblical story in such a beautiful way. It just fills it in, and it's very, very powerful. To walk the places, literally, we say where God has walked and brought his people. So it is a very holy place, and we went there with this first group, with a family, a couple and a niece of theirs, and we did this most of the time into Israel. We'll mostly stay with Gadi's family and some other people and some kibbutzes. And then we crossed over, and I had a friend that was over in Palestine, in Bet Jala at the seminary outside of Bethlehem. And I told my 3 other people, I said, now you're going to hear another story. We're going to go to the other side. That was very hard to hear because, I mean, I've been there before. I heard the story. And so the experience over there was very painful at moments. And when we got to the wall, we went, so where do you want to go now? We have one more stop. We went back to the wall, and the Western Wall, but it's also is known as the Wailing Wall. And everybody broke down. Wow. In one moment, you're standing in heaven. And then the next minute, you're standing in a difficult situation. So here it is, the place where God is working, but it is really like, it's just the microcosm of the universe, the center of the universe, and with all of its beauty and all of its pain. And so, please God, as we continue to walk forward, we heal the pain and bring that unity, bring that peace to such a difficult place. But it's a beautiful place, and the people are already living together. That's what I find so wonderful. My favorite place is to go what I call my office. Maybe we'll take you there someday. My office is at Jaffa Gate. It's a little bench that sits outside. I go to the St. George Market, and I buy one of those little beers, and I sit out there and just watch the whole world go by. And it's on the, I guess, the western side of the city. The Jews use that as a big entry point from the residences to go to the wall. Muslims enter through there, and all the Christian groups. So you see folks from Africa, from Asia, and it is all the nations of the earth have come to Jerusalem. So it's already there. Now, is there still more to be done? Oh, my Lord, yes. But there are people living together and have been living together, even though there's flare-ups and stuff at times. But it's a wonderful experience, and all the pilgrims, when they go there, we always have people that are very, nervous Nellies, and then they get nervous about going. And after the second day, how you doing? Oh my God, this is wonderful. What was I worried about? This is great. So it's happened all the time, and so it's a vibrant place of life. Also, it's a wonderful, wonderful place. It is the Holy Land.
Yeah, Rabbi, talk about your impressions of Israel. What it means to you. I do believe, just from a pure historical perspective, that is our nucleus, right? Our societal nucleus. Our problems are going to be solved there. Right? So talk about what it means to you. Talk about what you see there. Talk about the challenges there and how that resonates out to humanity.
So through the work of Project Genesis, I was working on a concept that called from Egypt to Rehoboth. Egypt in Hebrew means narrow, and Rehoboth means wide. And I've realized that the journey, the Jewish journey, and actually the human journey, should be from Egypt to Rehoboth, from narrow to wide. The Jewish people was born from Egypt, which was narrow. But narrow in Egypt means that you always have someone on top of another person. It's the mindset of someone has to be on top, or someone has to be instead of. And alternatively, we can look at the situation as we can be next to each other, shoulder to shoulder. And through the work with Father Roy, I realized that we don't have to be one instead of the other. We can really enrich each other. When I was a young child in Israel, we had in the building I lived in, we had a gardener who was a Palestinian, Arab Palestinian. And one day I was playing in the yard, and he approached me, and he said, I think I was about 7, and he said, do you know why I keep it beautiful here? And I just looked at him, and he said, because one day it will be mine. And I think this mindset that I grew up with was that it would have to be, at the end of the day, us or them.
Yeah.
And this is the tragic point of view that people grow up with, on our side, on their side, on everybody's side. And I left Israel after my army service because I was hopeless of the situation, of other things. It was 6 months before Rabin was shot, and it was right after Oslo, and buses were blowing up in Tel Aviv. And I had to take a break from all that and to unpack what it meant to be Jewish, what it meant to be a first-generation Jew in the land. My parents walked through the desert to get to Israel in 1949 to establish the Third Commonwealth. So for me as a first generation, there's a lot of responsibility. What does that mean? To come back to the land after thousands of years and to reestablish Judaism, especially that there's people in the land already. Do we have to live instead of them, or can we live with them? So today, fast forward, I would say what I've learned is that really, whether we like each other or not, it's not the point. It's that we have to live together. And through the pilgrimages that we've taken every year, I realized the reality is actually a lot better than it seems from the news or from anybody's eyes. Because Jews and Palestinians not only live together, they work together, they flourish together, and they actually need each other. Today I know we need each other. So the idea of Rehoboth moving from narrow to wide, and maybe we'll talk about it further, about our peace proposal this year that we're putting on the table, that's saying, you know what, not only do we have Jews and Palestinians in the land, now I understand that Christianity is very much in the land and needs to have a place around the table. You know, because empires came and went. But the three faiths, the three religions, have been there for thousands of years. So when we speak to politicians and they tell us that they don't want to deal with religions when they speak about peace processes because they don't want to deal with issues and problems, why bring up problems? Well, if you're not going to bring up those issues, you're never going to solve anything, because that is the core of the problem, or the challenges, and of course the solution.
And the solution.
Right.
The solution, yeah. Yeah, so with this peace proposal, the two parts that I find very intriguing is to say that we must deal with the religious question, and politicians and all the rest have just excise the whole thing. It's just, okay, that's something else. We know better. You know, we're secular now. We understand everything. And but certainly, at least like-minded clergy or open clergy need to be a part of this process as well, to help to lead our people, to say, okay, this is where we can try to find the common ground and be invited by the political class to say, well, yeah, why aren't some clergy at least involved in this process? So that I find very interesting. And that we're also saying, you know, that Christians ought to be part of this. Unfortunately, you know, every time you have a kind of a system between, you know, who's going to win, who's going to lose, two, there's always a seesaw effect all the time. But by adding the third, by maybe adding the church in some way, the Christians, it makes like a little tripod thing, a little maybe some balance to it that we could try to work together. So I find that an intriguing idea in the proposal, that we're just putting it out there, to begin this discussion of course, well, what kind of power do we have? We're, you know, because just a little group here with a common vision. But Project Genesis is going to present this in Jerusalem when we are at the end of our pilgrimage coming up in February. We're going in February 3rd, and then on the night of February 11th, we'll be presenting this at the hotel with a group of people that'll be coming and to listen to the full proposal. Of course it's complicated a little bit, but I find those two ideas very important. And then the other point, can I just jump in there with the point? As I've studied it, you know, for 100 years now, that all the gyrations that have happened, and, you know, let's go here, let's go. If we can start to agree perhaps on the water for Ramallah. If we could just get that, then we can build. And this proposal actually flips the whole idea, because the head of the whole thing, of course, is the religious question, Temple Mount. And so what Rabbi Gadi is beginning to ponder, what if we say nobody moves? Nobody moves. That could Jews concede that, okay, Muslims take the Temple Mount. We relinquish claims. Wow, what an idea that could be. And we will stay. We've been praying at the wall now for a long time. So can we pray there? You pray there, we pray here. Christians pray over there. We just let it be. Now, it's much more complicated than that. It's not just a simple idea like that. But that's a very important idea. And it begins at the top, actually. Usually we say, okay, well, we'll do the water systems first. And that's, if we get that, then we'll go there someday. And this is going to flip the whole thing and says, if we can agree, let's go right to the top, right to the nexus here. Let's just go right there. And then the rest will follow. So it's a proposal. It's an idea.
I want to ask a question, because one of the things, Father Roy and I have talked about this. I haven't had a chance to dialogue a lot with you about it. So one of the things that I believe is the hand of God is with the Jews. Throughout history, the hand of God follows the Jews, and really that gives me a lot of hope and a lot of faith. The Jewish community gives me a lot of hope and a lot of faith. They've endured more than any other have had to endure throughout the history of mankind. And I'm always curious, because I just don't know enough about it, and this is all part of educating ourselves, right? I'm always curious that, having been a tribe that's always been on the move because they've been oppressed, right, that why place becomes so important. Why does place become so important? If where you are is where God is, then why does place become so important? That's always just been a question I've had.
That's a great question. When before the temple was established, there was really no one place for worshiping. And when the temple was established, it became one place. Most of the Jewish history, the Jews were not in their place. But spiritually, they were always there. And that is the glue that really kept them. We always, for 2,000 years, outside the land, everybody in Europe, in Yemen, and it doesn't matter where we were, we always faced that place. Now, the word place in Hebrew, hamakom, is also the name for God. So when you look for the place, you really look for God. And part of our proposal, and I think it'll demonstrate what we're talking about, is God is always telling us throughout history is don't attribute to the physical place like it was really God, right? Don't worship the stones. But understand that the place, whatever you decide is the place, is a tent of meeting. So it can be a tent. It doesn't have to be the bricks, the stones. But the meeting is the most important thing. So it happens that this is the place that God chose, history chose, the people of Israel, now the three faiths chose. But the place itself is less important than the meeting. And actually, there's in Kings, in the second Samuel, when David wants to build the temple, and he talks to the prophet and tells him, I live in this beautiful home, cedar home, and God lives in a tent. I want to build God a beautiful house. And the prophet comes to him with an answer from God. And basically says, God tells David, who asked you to build a house for me? I'm happy living in a tent. The most important thing is that I go around the tribes and there's a tent of meeting. So we've attributed too much to the place rather than the meeting. So the proposal that we're proposing is that really the meeting is the most important. There's a midrash, a story of where did God choose to put his Holy of Holies, and it's a story about a father who passed away and gave his two sons equal share of the inheritance, but one had a family and one did not have a family, and they both thought of each other. And they thought, one with the family thought, my brother doesn't have a family, he needs more money to take care of himself when he grows old. And then the brother without the family thought about his brother and said, oh, I'm by myself, my brother has a big family, he needs more money. And they each took part of the inheritance and went to give the other. And where they met, God said, this will be my Holy of Holies. So the point is that we can move our Holy of Holies if we meet somewhere. So historically, this is the place, the Western Wall, Temple Mount, this is where we've been praying. So I don't suggest moving from there, but we have to move in our mind to say the most important thing is where we meet, not where the stones are.
Very well said. I applaud that. I applaud that position and you taking that publicly. One of the things I want to ask each of you, right? So in your journey together in Project Genesis, I want to ask you, what is the most interesting, enlightening thing that you've learned about Judaism, and for you, what is the most interesting and enlightening thing you've learned about Christianity? So, Father Roy, we'll start with you.
Oh, there's just so many things. Really, where to begin? This is a 13-year project, and so it's astounding how much I've learned. And the one thing I often tell as I go through the story of just with Project Genesis, I think I shared this one with you, is my favorite to share, and it's with the fall of Adam and Eve. Just it's a profound story, but Adam and Eve eat the fruit of the tree, and they realized they were naked. And what happens in the story is that they realize they're naked, they sow fig leaves, and then the next line is, and then God comes down at the breezy time of the day. Now, just to preface, it's a little bit of a developed story, but Gadi referenced that it was on a Friday that this happened. Well, how's a Friday? What does that mean, Friday? He said, well, it was on the sixth day Adam and Eve were created. Oh, that's interesting. It is a Friday, okay, but that's not when they fell. So after more discussion, he brought up the idea, the midrash there, that that when God came down at the breezy time of the day, that is late afternoon. That's a specific Hebrew phrase. It's not just means anytime the wind blows, just some day. And so basically what we're seeing is like an alignment with the fall happening midday on a Friday. And I then informed him, which was to his shock, 3 o'clock on a Friday is very significant for Christians. It's in the text. And so here is a connection between the fall and the redemption, as from our perspective, redemption. And so that was astounding. Just a thousand other things that have happened. Understand our roots, especially as Eucharistic Mass celebrating Christians, taking the Last Supper and celebrating the Last Supper continually now, as we also call it very simply the Last Seder. That's how Gadi called it the Last Seder. Now that's a mind-blowing idea for a lot of people, but it's a very simple one, but very profound and not well known. So the job of Project Genesis is to help Christians, understand their Jewish roots. They're not so foreign. And we really find fellowship with the community, and then, of course, appropriate our own faith even more deeply.
Rabbi?
So I think the proof is in the pudding for me. 2 years into teaching together, I quit my corporate job, and went into rabbinical school. So it means that when I was teaching Christians, I really was taught about my own faith. And it was like looking in the mirror. When you look in the mirror, you don't really see exactly how you look, but you look and you see some sort of image that reminds you of yourself. When we started, we thought, let's start talking about what we agree on. And 13 years later, we still are talking about what we agree on. And so we avoid conflict. by first talking about what we agree on. And I think that we can continue like this for 1,000 years. And if we keep talking about what we agree on for 1,000 years, we'll forget to fight. This is the whole point of entering that ultimate Sabbath of before the fall. So the Midrash that Father Roy was talking about explains that Adam and Eve could have eventually eaten from the fruit of knowledge, although it was not ready yet. So if they had waited another 3 hours, basically 3 hours before sundown, so that makes it 3 o'clock, about 3 o'clock on a Friday, we would have entered the ultimate Sabbath. So one day in God's life is 1,000 years in our lives. So we would have entered that ultimate Sabbath of 1,000 years that we would have forgotten to even fight. So this is the ultimate idea. But getting back to the fourth child, I think it's very important because in the Seder, when we talk about the 4 children, so the first one is the wise, the second one is the wicked, the third one is the simple, and the fourth one is the one that does not know how to ask or can't ask. And there's a teaching about these 4 children that is very important and appropriate to what we do, is that these are 4 generations. The first child, just like, let's say, an Italian immigrant that come to America, and the first generation, they're wise, they know the tradition, right? So they still look at themselves as they're part of that tradition. And the difference between the wise and the wicked is one thing. The wise still sees themselves, or himself or herself, as part of the tradition that their parents brought. The wicked knows everything too, but still starts to separate themselves from the tradition. He says, what is this tradition to you? The simple one is the generation that is neither here nor there, because they're already removed. But the 4th generation doesn't even know how to engage in a conversation. They don't even know the vocabulary to even engage in a conversation. And this has been really now that I look back on the first Seder we did, that person that couldn't ask, I understand that this became our mission to open up the conversation for them. So through opening up the conversation to them, I learned so much about my own faith. And of course, this is the result that I became a rabbi, and a rabbi of a congregation and a community that teaches not only Christians, but of course, Jews as well.
Can I just add one thing? Another very important thing about, especially like for the business community, as you're talking to this particular group, the beauty of Shabbat, the beauty of the Sabbath, has been totally lost in the United States at this point in time. And knowing Rabbi Gadi now and seeing how he celebrates the Sabbath and how important it is to rest, and how that has been totally obliterated in Western culture at this point. Sunday is just another day. So I'm trying to recover at the shrine and at my preaching and teaching a lot of times. Let's remember the Sabbath, and God made us to enjoy His creation. We need to work on our relationships, our family. We need to rest. We need to worship. And for us to work better. But otherwise, if we remove the Sabbath from our thinking and our practice, we really are that little hamster on the wheel. And we're just going around and around and around. And we wonder why today so many people are just at wit's end. They haven't had that rest, and they haven't sought wisdom. They have a lot of knowledge. Boy, oh boy, do we have knowledge. But to find the wisdom of God, now that's a spiritual journey. And that's why, since the beginning of my ministry too, pilgrimage has always been a part of my desire to lead people on a pilgrimage, because you do have to stop your clock, get off the clock, so that you can find divine time and find God's clock. And so by literally going to a different place and carving out some time, new things can happen, new growth spiritually can happen. And I just find so many people just stuck in the rat race, as they call it, around and around it goes. And it's such a sadness for me, as I see so many people even lose their families. One gentleman come in and talks about, he's lost his kids. He's working all the time, working. And now he feels like he's lost his family. Please God, he can retrieve it. But so many stories like this I hear at the shrine. So it's an important thing for the business community, for leadership. Give your people a break. They have to have that Sabbath. Now, for some it's going to be Friday, for some it'll be Saturday, some it'll be Sunday. But if you're not celebrating something, you're missing a lot about what life is all about.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that a little bit, and I want to get back to the point you made about the fourth generation. I mean, I think it is very clear that as a country we've sort of lost we've lost our way. At this point, I can tell you from my perspective. So I'm the third generation, and my daughter is the fourth generation. She's a junior at Fordham University, and you figure a Jesuit college, but they're not leading them down any sort of path there as well. I mean, higher education has gotten to be where there's so much pressure to get tuition dollars that it's sort of lost their focus. How did you make that choice to go from business to a man of faith, and what realistically, particularly for the business community that watches this show, what realistically do we need to get back to be able to get that tradition back in our lives? Because it's gone.
Absolutely. I say twice in my life, I said, thank God that I keep the Sabbath. One, when I worked in the corporate world, I worked for a bank, Société Générale, and I remember people working around the clock. And even when they were taking vacations, they would call in. We had to take a vacation for 2 weeks straight because they had to look through our computers. And the people who took 2 weeks off still called into the office every day. And I remember promising myself I would never be in the situation that I would work somewhere where I cannot go away, because that means slavery. The difference between Egypt and Rehoboth means that is the Sabbath, because if you don't stop, that means you're a slave. If you can't put your phone away for a few hours, you're a slave to your phone. So instead of using the phone is using you. That is the difference. And that's why we call it the source of blessing. The Sabbath is the source of blessing, that you can tell the world, I'm now in charge. 6 days I work, but I'm now in charge and decide to stop. A slave cannot decide to stop, but I'm in charge. So and take that time off to really contemplate, to think that the creation, God's creation, was not complete until God rested, until he looked back at creation and said it was good. If we can't take that break and take a step back and contemplate, then we're just slaves going around the hamster wheel. The next step, when you step back and contemplate and study, take that time to learn, then you understand and you can incorporate other people and other ideas into your life. Otherwise, if you're in this race, it's always, I have to be on top, I have to achieve more, and we're always going to stay one above the other or one instead of the other. That is the key, is to take a break. But for that, you have to it's a leap of faith. The other time I thank God for keeping the Sabbath is when I was with my sister and her family and the kids in Disney World. And they kept going, and I thought at a certain point, after 7 days going through all the parks, I've had enough, and thank God I keep the Sabbath. And then I said, all right, I can't go. God, ordains that I stay here. So, but this is what it is. It's to stay, is to keep yourself, to withhold back The first commandment of God to Adam and Eve was not to do something. It was to stay away from something, right? Stay away from the tree of knowledge. Stay back. And we say that God actually, according to Kabbalah, created the world this way. Because if God is omnipresent, omnipotent, it means that there's no other anything but God. So how did God even create anything? Something outside of him. So the idea is that he contracted himself to allow room for somebody else or something else to exist, right? So when we keep the Sabbath and we hold ourselves back, which is the hardest thing to do, to hold ourselves back, and all the commandments, really, at the bottom of all the commandments, the idea is that to teach ourselves to what I call to curb our enthusiasm, right? So we can't allow our neighbor to exist. To really love our neighbor, we have to allow them to exist. So the Sabbath, to take a break, is where we really connect with God. And on that idea of contracting ourselves, and this is why we call it the source of blessing.
That's really interesting.
Another thing I could add to this, Gadi has introduced me to the beautiful Hebrew language, and every word, every letter means something. So English has its own roots, of course, but I love to preach about the idea of recreation. But the word is really recreation. And so sometimes we forget and we get lost in recreation on the Sabbath, but it really is meant to be recreative. And then we are doing the work of God in our family, in our relationships, in the world. So we need to do that recreation. I love to hear that too, this idea that God wants us to cooperate with him and to learn from him so that we could create the space, the holy space in this world where new life, of course, always comes forth. So.
Yeah, I want to turn to current day because I think we're challenged here in America today. The way that I think you guys are trying to help educate Christians and Jews as to commonality. In the secular world, you have two political parties that are looking to come out on top and win and not find commonality as human beings and as Americans. And I opened the program talking about the terrible shooting that happened in Pittsburgh on Saturday. And I know you had a chance to address your congregation about it, and I'm sure you did too. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about it. I mean, to me, I got to be honest with you, like you, Father, I grew up here on Long Island. My block were Christians and Jews. We all hung out together. We just celebrated different holidays. I never really understood a deep-rooted anti-Semitic vibe. Just never got it, never understood it. Can't imagine that it exists in our society today, but it does. It obviously does. And I'm curious about how you address your congregation and what your thoughts are about that.
So I want to send, of course, our condolences to the Tree of Life. It's a congregation in Pittsburgh, and Jeffrey Myers, Rabbi Jeffrey Myers. He's a cantor as well, and he is part of our conservative movement, the Judaism. So he's a colleague of mine, and I can't imagine what he's now facing. The way I treat it is I look at it as and I wrote about this, that it's like the burning bush. Judaism and the Jewish people are like the burning bush. You know, it's burning, but it does not diminish. So somehow we keep, we're there because we keep going into that center. We're very centered. So that is the key. And I think the Sabbath, of course, is one of those ideas. And the fact that it happened on the Sabbath, it goes to the heart. And in the sanctuary, it really went to the heart of it. But in order to solve these things, I think the root of it is always the the rhetoric. You know, we can put guards, we can do, we can have gun control, we can have all these things. But unless we change our narrative, we change our rhetoric in those sanctuaries, in churches and synagogues and mosques, it's never going to change. And of course, in government, we have to change our narrative that it's not one community that causes all the problems in the world. We share this world, so the success and the failures of this world. So designating or blaming one group at a time because it's easy and making them a scapegoat, that is the root of the problem. So we have to change the narrative and the rhetoric, and understand that this is the core. And I'll just give you an example. The third person that is going on the trip with us, and of course he's the third person in Project Genesis, Dr. Don Russo, he studied in Rome during Second Vatican Council in the 60s, and that's why he's coming with us, and then we're going to go to Rome as well. But he can testify to the time before and after the church changed its rhetoric, its narrative, and how impactful that was on the Christian world and on the Jewish world. That really was the core of the change that the Christian holidays were no longer a danger to Jews. Because the church changed its narrative, took responsibility, and said Jews are no longer blamed for killing Jesus, and that because they did that, we now suffer in the world. They changed the narrative, and they flipped it all around and said, not only that, they are our elder in the faith, and we should work together. And in the last 100 years, if you think about it, before Second Vatican Council, and of course World War II, the Jews and Judaism and Christianity fought for centuries, and that turned it around. Actually, the Muslim world and Judaism were not in such big conflict. It was really in the last century that it all flipped. And why? It's not theological. It's all about the narrative, and it's all about what we teach each other, maybe for political gains, in our sanctuary. So once we change the narrative and turn the rhetoric around, that would change the atmosphere.
Yeah, and from my perspective, and I want you to touch on this, but from my perspective, it's always been incredibly weird, I guess is the only word I know how to use it, when there's anti-Semitic violence, people doing it in the name of Christianity, which seems to be the antithesis of Christianity, at least as I understand it. And so from the Catholic perspective and a Christian perspective, how do you address this? How do you help people understand this dilemma?
Well, it is a changing of rhetoric, but also it's just really a changing of hearts. And so hearts need to draw close to God. And I think a lot of rhetoric is the secular rhetoric of also we can make the world better without God. I just see that as a disaster in the making. And so...
Why? We're doing such a great job,
We're doing
aren't
such a great job. And so we've made God go away, and so God is not happy, but he withdraws. He does withdraw. And I think a crassness happens in the heart, and then it's where evil can manifest. So I think it is really a spiritual battle. But it is between good and evil, light and darkness. And Christians don't have only access to God's grace. God's life is in the world as well, in many places. But when we leave God out of the picture, consciously or unconsciously, I think that's where evil can really take root and then begins to unveil itself.
We have a few minutes left, but I do want to touch on one other point, which I want to make sure I get it right, because I remember that I thought it was a very interesting point, and Second Vatican Council, I was born in the 60s, I went through religious ed, and it was the biggest thing, from a Catholic's perspective. But there was something else you and I talked about, and I want you to talk about it, and that was that I think you had mentioned for the first time, senior leaders from the Jewish community had acknowledged that a triune God that's worshipped by Christians did not run afoul, at least from a Jewish perspective, of there being one God or something like that. Am I saying that right, or was that?
There was a paper that was produced, or a consensus of Orthodox. Wasn't it Orthodox rabbis who made a statement? You'd know the history of it better, but basically concludes and teaches now that Christians are not idolaters, and that the Trinitarian concept doesn't mean that we worship three gods and all the rest. So there was at least an acknowledgement that Christians are separate and unique, but somehow connected to the promises of Abraham. One thing the rabbi also, I quote this a lot too in my preaching sometimes, he says, we have our problems within Judaism. We are all groups and all the rest, and in the whole world, what is 12 million, 14 million people in the world at this point. But you people have taken the name of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to the nations. Now, it's an amazing thing. So we have taken the God of Israel to the nations. So let's celebrate that. Let's celebrate that there is a communion there. And then with our Islamic brothers and sisters there too, to try to reach out to them too, to work for the peace that God desires. And so as we work with Project Genesis, it's really to establish community of encounter. That's what we're trying to do. Pope Francis talks about this all the time. Some people, I remember, I've brought some of my missionary brothers who have been missionaries in, they're from Indonesia or from New Guinea, and Gadi's met some of these people now, and I've never met a Jew in my life. Just an amazing thing to see that happen. So at least now they've been to a synagogue. They actually have an experience. That's better than nothing. And of course, it begins to inform your ideas and your thinking, and then of course your behavior as well. So this is an important journey. It's not something that just, okay, I got a degree now or something. I learned a concept or something, but it's an experience of fellowship.
It's funny. The reason why that story sticks out to me is because when I was a younger kid, one of my closest friends, he was Jewish, and he went on to be an attorney, and we've stayed in touch. And I remember when we were kids, he would say, "You Catholics overly complicate everything. Because I could never comprehend these three aspects of God and a triune God." He's like, "The Jews, we keep it simple. There's one God. That's all we have to understand. There's no overly complications here, and we'll do it." And a lot of time is spent in religious ed as young teenagers trying to understand that. But at least the way I see it, and I'll tell you as I see it from a lay perspective at this point, right? Is if there's God and we believe in God, then how we choose to worship or bring that God out in us, right, can be a very personal thing. But as long as we're all working towards that same common goal, to bring that love and the best in everybody out, then why does it have to be that one's right and one's wrong, one's better and one's worse? Why can't we work towards commonality? Right? It's our soul. It's my soul.
So we didn't think we'll have all the answers, but we, in the last 13 years, have been trying to discuss that, and we're still discussing that. So just discussing it together and trying to find the commonality is already a common place, a common God.
I love that. I absolutely love it. I have to tell you, it's really changed just these interactions that we've had and the discussions we've had has really changed my thinking and my paradigm of how I just even think about the whole sort of spiritual nature of man. We have about 30 seconds, left. So I just want to take some time to thank you guys. I mean, this is really one of those moments in a life and in a career that's very poignant from my perspective, because you started Project Genesis, as a grassroots movement to find commonality. And maybe God led you to this point, to be in such a divided country today, where this message needs to get out. There needs to be more of what makes us alike rather than what makes us different. And in such a connected world, we need to be coming more together rather than being pulled apart. So, Father Roy, Rabbi Gadi, I want to thank you so much for being here for this important message to our viewers. I know we could have gone on for another hour. I understand that. And these gentlemen could have talked for 2 more hours, I'm sure. But we will have them back again in the future to get a catch-up and see how the pilgrimage goes in February. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you very much, Joe.
Amen. Thank you.
So, but the idea is that when Moses even went to get the Torah, the scripture, he got instructions of how to interpret the scripture. You can't live a written word. You have to have description. The menorah is in the holies, in the section of the holies, and the menorah is supposed to reflect that light, the light of the Torah, the oral tradition that you live according to it. So the structure of the menorah is very interesting. It has 7 candle holders, or it was oil, of course, the oil holders. And it really is, if you look at it, it's like the week. There's the creation.